Hello, class. We are going to wrap up Lesson 10, World War II. This is part 4 of the lesson, and we are going to deal with the turning points of the war in the Pacific and the end of World War II. Before we move on to the Pacific, this is American and Soviet soldiers shaking hands along the Elbe at just outside of Berlin to bring about an end to the war in Europe, VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. Also wanted to take a look before we get into the Pacific at the Potsdam Conference. Harry S. Truman, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin gathered in Potsdam, Germany from July 17th through August 2nd to decide how to administer punishment to the defeated Nazi Germany, which will lead to the Nuremberg trials and ultimately the Jewish homeland of Israel, which had agreed on an unconditional surrender 9 weeks earlier on May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, which we just discussed with the image of the American and Soviet soldiers shaking hands along the Elbe. The goals of the conference also included the establishment of post-war order, peace treaties, issues like what will lead to the creation of the United Nations. The United Nations had already come about, had been discussed in Yalta, and it was later discussed in San Francisco, but it will be continued. They will continue to determine the creation of the United Nations at Potsdam as well, and then the countering the effects of the war, economic, social, etc. Allies also needed to determine how the war would end in Japan. Some would say that this was the true start of the Cold War because there was a great deal of tension, especially between Churchill and Stalin at this particular meeting. In fact, one thing that you can notice is that there's never a picture where Stalin and Churchill are sitting side by side. It was either, Roosevelt or Truman there between the two. These were the Nuremberg trials where the Nazis, high-ranking Nazi officials, were put on trial for war crimes, and a number of those individuals were executed. The Pacific Theater. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941 obviously pulled us into the war and led to our declaration of war on Japan the next day. The major turning point, which I previously discussed in the Pacific earlier, was the Miracle of Midway, or the Battle of Midway, fought June 3rd to 6th, 1942. The reason that was known as a miracle was for a couple of different reasons. Number one, we were able to save the American base at Midway. Number two, we were able to break the Japanese Code Purple. And number three, we were able to take out 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. American naval forces were led by Admiral Chester Nimitz, who defeated a much larger Japanese force as it prepared to seize Midway Island. Coming only 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a Japanese victory at Midway would have easily enabled Japan to invade Hawaii. The American victory ended the Japanese threat to Hawaii and began a series of American victories in what became known as the Island Hopping Campaign to get America closer and closer to Japan. As I previously mentioned, we also broke the Japanese Code Purple. This is the aerial dogfight, a bird's eye view of the Battle of Midway, which was a carrier-based battle. And on the left here we have a map of Midway Island and the Midway Island Lagoon. Pacific Theater and island hopping from 1942 to 1945. The Battle of Coral Sea was a very important American victory in May of 1942. It was the start of the carrier-based fighting. It also allowed for America to stave off the Japanese from taking control of shipping lanes between Hawaii and Australia. Marines took Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands from August to November of 1942. The Marines that took the island were reduced to eating roots. They fought, to the last, really down to the last man, with very limited naval support until the Japanese either were killed, committed suicide, or surrendered. The Battle of Saipan, fought in June of 1944, ended with a grisly aftermath that was a mass suicide of not only Japanese civilians, but also Japanese soldiers who jumped from a cliff after the battle due to anti-American sadist propaganda. Not all of the Japanese soldiers committed suicide with the cliff jump. A number of them took their own lives in caves and in other ways on the island. Iwo Jima and Okinawa, I'm sorry, my apologies, I skipped over the American forces retaking the Philippines in 1944, so this was a massive turning point, and Douglas MacArthur most certainly did return to the Philippines. This is also where my grandfather served as a coastal artilleryman who was from Clifton Forge, Virginia. He fought in the Philippines at a turning point battle in the Philippines known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Iwo Jima and Okinawa from March to June of 1945 was the American invasion of a group of Pacific islands that brought American forces closer than ever to Japan. But both invasions cost thousands of American lives and even more Japanese lives as Japanese soldiers fought fiercely over every square inch of the islands, and Japanese soldiers and civilians committed suicide rather than surrender. A number of American military casualties were lost here. There's also, find it important to point out the loss of Ernie Pyle in the Battle of Okinawa. He was the most famous war correspondent for the United States during World War II, and he was what they called the Dog Faces writer or the Dog Faces journalist, because Ernie Pyle not only told the stories from the front lines with amazing amount of honesty, he actually went into battle with soldiers from Italy, actually North Africa to Italy to Normandy, all the way to the Pacific. So that was a pretty significant loss, in addition to all the servicemen that were lost there as well. So with the American occupation of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, this would allow American bombers to drop napalm and ultimately atomic bombs on Japanese cities to end the war, though the Enola Gay and the Boxcar, the planes that dropped the atomic bombs, those planes took off from Tinian and Saipan islands that were farther away from the Japanese mainland. This is Douglas MacArthur returning to the Philippines. This is MacArthur. Here we have the flag raising atop Mount Suribachi at Iwo Jima. This is beach landing at Okinawa. And then you can see we have Saipan. We've got the Philippines. We have Iwo Jima. We have Okinawa. And we have mainland Japan. So the use of the atomic bomb Facing the prospect of horrendous casualties among both Americans and Japanese if American forces had to invade Japan itself, President Harry S. Truman ordered the use of atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force the Japanese to surrender. These targets were chosen because they not only were large commercial centers, but there was also significant amount of military output in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Tens of thousands of people were killed in both cities. Shortly after the bombs were used, the Japanese leaders surrendered, avoiding the need for American forces to invade mainland Japan. On August 6, 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets and the crew of the Enola Gay dropped the first bomb, and on the 9th, General Charles Sweeney and the boxcar crew dropped the bombs on Nagasaki. The Manhattan Project, top secret project that had been developed throughout the war, was used to create the atomic bomb. So, Victory in Japan Day, VJ Day. The Japanese instrument of surrender was the written agreement that enabled the surrender of Japan, marking the end of World War II. It was signed by representatives from Japan, the United States, the Republic of China, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, the French Republic, the Netherlands, and New Zealand. The surrender was signed on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945, and on behalf of the United States, Commander of the U.S. Army forces in the Pacific, Douglas MacArthur, accepted the surrender of Japan. The UK Victory in Japan Day was August 15th, 1945, and the U.S. Victory in Japan Day was the actual surrender day, September 2nd, 1945. And then this is the famous Life magazine photo of the Victory in Japan Day in Times Square. All right. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you all very much.